you very much for coming to this session, because we recognise that it sits a little bit outside of the remaining sessions, but nevertheless we would argue a very, very important discussion, and we hope it would be a discussion. Myself and David will present, and then hopefully we'll have the opportunity to have a bit of feedback, Q&A in relation to the things that we've talked about. And the things we are going to talk about is this, which some of you, I hope most of you are familiar with, which is part 2 of the official guide, otherwise known, I suppose, in shorthand as the rule book for the playing rules of both Gaelic football and hurling. Now, to begin with, I will lay out the ground. I'll speak for about 15 minutes, and then I'll pass over to David Gough, who I assume you're much more interested in hearing from in relation to his insight into some of the things that would have happened, let's say, over the last season or maybe even the season before, and which contextualise a lot of the things we're going to talk about. So this rule book, which, as I say, covers hurling and football, runs to 130 pages. And the section Rule 5, which deals with aggressive fouls, and these are the things for which people get cards, yellow cards, black cards, red cards, for the most part, not exclusively. If you combine hurling and football, runs to over 40 pages. And as David will no doubt tell you when refereeing a game here or somewhere else, trying to remember all of those rules, and far less implement them, is quite a challenge. So, as Tracy's indicated, we as a committee feel now is the right time to look at part 2 of the official guide and to begin to make it a whole lot easier for people to understand and I suppose implement, most particularly so for referees. So, as Tracy's indicated, I'm the chairperson of the standing committee, and our primary role is to monitor the consistent application of the playing rules. So, let's assume that we have, we don't need to assume, we do have inconsistent application of the playing rules. That begs the question, what do we do about it? Well, really, in essence, there are at least 2 entities involved with that. One is the referees, the other is the rule book. And I suppose the dominant view up until now has been, and David no doubt will perhaps agree with us, to point the finger at referees and to say it's down to the referees. We take the view the starting point must be the rule book that they're seeking to implement. And so, in essence, that's what we're going to examine over the course of this year, and in particular to recognise that a large part of this rule book is quite dated. By now it's over 35 years old. For the most part it was written in 1984. The football rules by Joe Lennon and the hurling rules by Frank Murphy. And of course what has happened since then is that it's just been added to. Something happens, a new rule is made and it's put in there. Very little is taken out. Mostly things are added to. So that's our aspiration, and our argument is that we need to move away from what is termed a categorization of rules towards a classification of rules. Now, I recognise those are 2 words that sound pretty much similar, and in fact, for the most part, may even mean something similar. But let me give you a worked example. So I've referred to aggressive fouls. So these are the things, again, you get a yellow card for, maybe a red card for. Currently, let's take the case of football. There are 6 categories of aggressive fouls, and they're listed and they're detailed. One obvious difficulty when it comes to implementing those rules is that some of them are worded very closely to rules that actually exist in a different category. So when it comes to implementing them, it's difficult for a referee to know for sure which category of foul has taken place. And so again, in shorthand, what we're saying is that we should move away from that categorization because of its complexity and the difficulties associated with it, and move instead to a much more common sense way of analysing foul play. So we talk now in terms of fouls being dangerous or cynical or just incidental. So let's imagine that a game is taking place outside here on the pitch, and a foul takes place. The likelihood we would say that was a dangerous foul. You know, we would just use that sort of common sense approach. Or we would say that that's a cynical foul. You know, okay, we need to put in place criteria, we need to put in place examples and so forth, but it's that sort of common sense approach to rule making that we're trying to move towards. Okay, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but I recognize that I want to keep you with me rather than just talking at a distance. So let's look at some evidence that might support the need for us to move towards this classification system. So we carried out some analysis of the most recent All-Ireland hurling and football championships. And what we're recognising now is that we're starting to see certain types of fouls taking place to a much greater extent than would have been the case heretofore. Dangerous conduct, particularly this head-high contact, now accounts for about 11% of all fouls. But it's particularly, I draw your attention to the cynical fouling, and particularly in hurling, I have to say, that is drawing our attention and asking us, does the rule book, as it's currently constituted, allow for adequate recourse to those types of fouls that are taking place? And their argument is that it doesn't. I mentioned hurling. So we've looked at the hurling championship. Well, looked at 20 games across the last 3 seasons, 2017 to 19. And a very interesting element is, if we look at this classification of the types of fouls that are happening in these hurling matches, inter-county games, what we're finding is that if we were to use this term cynical or disruptive conduct, almost half the fouls fall into that category. And again, if you drill down a little bit, a total of 29 of those fall into this sort of professional foul category. This is the classic situation where a forward, for instance, is in on goal and he's simply dragged down. Okay. Now, that then it sort of gives rise to 2 issues. One, how is that dealt with in hurling? Well, here's how those 29 professional fouls were dealt with. 16 resulted in yellow cards, so just over half. 12 got no card whatsoever, and 1 got a red card. So if you take away the red card, you could have either got a yellow card or, in fact, nothing at all. So it raises the question as to what we do about the prevalence of cynical fouling, both in football and hurling, and how adequate the rule book is to deal with that. So in undertaking this piece of work, what we're suggesting is we need a series of guiding principles. So, I mean, this official guide part 2 has always landed on the too hard to deal with pile. I mean, I think all of us have been saying that the rule book is complex, it's difficult and to deal with and so on. But for the most part, we haven't really done anything about it. Well, we think it's probably about time we did do something about it. And so we think there's a series of guiding principles. I don't think anyone here would disagree with those. Well, you may, but I think they're fairly reasonable approaches to how we would seek to classify rule-violating conduct. I draw your attention in particular to the last one here, and in particular the need, we think, to issue sanctions that are proportionate. Okay, David will talk about this in a few minutes. Transparent, but particularly contemporaneous. Basically, that's a fancy word of saying on the day, so that the incident is dealt with there and then. Because often what happens is foul play takes place, it's dealt with in some way at the game itself, but then that gives rise to a series of appeals and so on and so forth. We think that we need to move more towards dealing with foul play on the day. So what is the aim of this work that we're going to undertake? There are loads of contradictions and anomalies and cul-de-sac, so on and so forth, in the current rulebook. So the starting point has to be to seek to remove those. David, I've sort of teeing David up constantly, but I've heard his presentation before and it's excellent. But I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Currently under Rule 5, aggressive fouls, Category 1 foul, you'll know this, David, includes to charge an opponent for the purpose of giving an advantage to a teammate. So if you do that, that's a Category 1 foul in football, and the penalty is a free kick on first occasion. Category 2 infraction, just think of the wording that I've just mentioned, includes to deliberately collide with an opponent after he's played the ball away or for the purpose of taking him out for the movement of play. Now, again, David will be able to tell us, but that sounds to me like pretty much the same thing. And yet the outcome is quite markedly different. So we need to look at those contradictions and anomalies and problems that may arise as a result of that. We also want to look at creating a condition which it no longer pays to foul. I mean, by now it's well established that the more successful teams foul more. So we need to take away that incentive to foul. We want to provide clarity. All the other things are fairly self-evident, and we want to take an evidence-based approach to any future proposals that we might come up with. Now, this is nothing new. As far back as 2007, there was recognition, probably actually before that, there's recognition that we needed to dismantle this culture of indiscipline And this gives rise, as you know, to the establishment of the Playing Rules Task Force the same year. So this is where I hand over to David. In very simple terms, we need to move towards a system where we're getting much greater consistency in the application of the rules, and they are much more simpler for us to understand, for referees to implement, and of course for players, crucially, to understand what foul play will result in what sanction. Okay? So, David, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much. Okay. Just to pick up where Dave left off, he was talking about the rule book. And it's interesting for me to start off and just ask how many people in the rules would actually be familiar with the rule book in this room, that have actually read it and would know the language of it. So probably less than 10%. We've about 4 people with hands up. So most people get their knowledge of the rules from teachers, from coaches, from other players, from parents, or from pundits on TV. And really the only way we can get our knowledge of the rules is from the rule book. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. There are 6 rules in the rule book. The first 3 are to do with fair play. They're things you can do with the ball. That's set play when the ball is stopped, and scores. Now the 3 that we're more concerned with are 4, 5 and 6, and they're foul play. So they're things that you can't do with the ball. They're technical fouls, which are fouls on the ball. There are aggressive fouls, which are fouls on the man. And 6 is dissent, which is how the player interacts with the referee. Our biggest problem is they are so complex, there are so many of them, and they're so difficult to read and to understand. When you go to Mass on Sunday and the plate is handed round in the church and you make a contribution, it means you've added to what's already there, or maybe you've added to something that wasn't there. But that's what a contribution means. If you go and look up the word melee in an English dictionary, what you'll see in the dictionary is nothing like what you'd see on the Gaelic football field. There's no correlation whatsoever. You'll even learn that the word melee is actually pronounced melee. It's just an Irish thing that we call it a melee. But the rules are so difficult to understand. They're so complex. And because of that complexity, it leads to so much inconsistency among all referees at all levels, even our level. Because what we get in Rule 5, and we'll just have a look at this, is our current categorization of foul play. So we have reds, 2 yellows equaling a red, a black, which will now be a sin bin, plus a yellow equal a red in football. We have a black for football only. We have a yellow. How many times can you foul before you get a yellow card? We've no idea. There's no consistency in relation to that rule. And then we have the noting system, which is a note plus a note equals a yellow card. Any further noting infraction, any further yellow card, or any further black card results in a red card. It is the most complicated carding system in any field sport in the world. There's 7 different carding outcomes. It's incredible to think that that's how complex our game has become. So when we look at specifically Rule 5 of the playing rules, there are 43 specific rules that I need to know when I'm on a football field, and that I need to be able to call on instantly. And what I need to be able to do is to say what I see on the field. Then I need to apply that to the language of the rules. And then I need to understand what is the consequence of that rule. So you have a 3-step process. And that all has to happen very, very quickly for referees. So in our heads, we need to say what we see, apply it to the language of the rule, and once you know the rule, you know what outcome comes afterwards. And these are the outcomes. 3 fouls of those 43 are free onlys. There are only 3 fouls allowed in Gaelic football that do not result in a note, a yellow card, a black card, or a red. Now, if I was to ask any player, or any manager, or any coach what those 3 fouls are, you'd struggle. I can guarantee you, if you asked inter-county referees, they would also struggle just to list those 3 fouls. To charge a goalkeeper in the small rectangle, to push an opponent in the back, or to charge while in possession of the ball. They're your 3 fouls that don't result in any noting afterwards. We then have 7 noting infractions. We have 4 yellow cards. This is only in Rule 5. There's 1 technical foul that's a yellow card, and there's about 4 or 5 in Rule 6. We have 5 incidents of black cards, and we have 21 red cards. And the language of the rules are so prescriptive that we need to make sure that what we see on a pitch actually fits the language of the rules, because there's all sorts of knock-on effects afterwards. So if we send off a player, report him for striking an opponent with the arm, and he's actually used the fist, the player will get off, or used to be able to get off, because of the prescriptive nature of the rules. We had a farcical situation, David, a few years ago, where a player was sent off for attempting to kick his opponent. Brought it to the boardroom, appealed it, because he actually kicked him. He made contact, and he was able to prove that the referee cited the wrong rule and got off actually for kicking his opponent. So that's the very prescriptive nature of the language of the rules, and it leaves us in a really difficult position. And they're impractical. They're really asking us to do the impossible over 70 to 80 minutes when we're out in Croke Park and the blood is flowing to all other parts of the body to keep you moving after running 11 kilometres on the pitch, and you're gasping for air, and you need the blood to be going to the brain to help you to remember 43 different specific rules. It just doesn't happen, and that's what leads to so much inconsistency in our matches. So what happens really, and what we're seeing more often, is that when the GAA see an incident on the field that they're not happy with, rather than dealing with it, they add a new rule to the rule book. So we have an incident like Lee Keegan throws a GPS at a football. Well, let's add a new rule in for the referees, so they don't have 43 now to remember, they have 44. And then Tommy Walsh wants to lift David Moran under the crossbar, and the GAA aren't happy with that. So we'll add another new rule, and that's 45. And you all know the rule changes that have come in over the last 3 or 4 years. There's been a huge amount of them. So the referees are being overburdened with a huge number of rules, which means they're getting more complex, which leads to more inconsistency. And that's our biggest difficulty. And what David and his group, which I'm a huge supporter of, are trying to do is to remove the categorization of foul play and move it into a classification. So if I could just simply explain that, rather than having 21 red card infractions that I needed to see a foul and say, what is that? Is that behaving in a manner dangerous to an opponent? Is it striking with the fist? Is it striking with the head? And I have to think about all the language and justify it in my head first. What they're talking about now is just saying a red card is dangerous play. That's it. The referee has a judgment to make, whether it's striking, spitting, stamping, kicking, behaving in a manner dangerous to an opponent, injuring an opponent recklessly. They're all language of different rules. We'll just be saying it's dangerous. So a red card would be dangerous play. A black card would be just cynical play. Because we know there are an awful lot of cynical fouls that happen in Gaelic football that do not fit into the language specific of the rules. So if you hold an opponent up as he's going through on goals and don't pull him down to the ground and prevent him from his scoring opportunity, that is a noting infraction. A noting infraction for holding an opponent. Whereas if he goes to the ground, it's a black card because it's seen as a deliberate pull down. Both are cynical, but only the deliberate pull down is categorized in the black card infractions. So what we're saying is dangerous play, cynical play, rough play, or disruptive play, whatever language. It leaves it very easy that we only have 3 or 4 aggressive fouls, and we decide what category the foul fits into. And it leads to much more consistency because the system is less complex. Do we understand where we're going with this? Just taking out the number of fouls and the prescriptive nature of it. David spoke about the one which is a bugbear for a lot of referees, which is to charge an opponent in the front or back for the purpose of giving an advantage to a teammate. What you would call a body check. That is a noting infraction. The same incident can be viewed by a referee as a deliberate collide for the purpose of taking an opponent out of a movement of play, which is a black card infraction. And there's where the inconsistency happens within Gaelic football. We have a lot of these anomalies in the rule book because nobody has sat down and gone through it and read it, because the game that's being played now is not the same game that those rules were written for in 1984. We now have, at our level, a win at all costs, where managers and players will manipulate the rules as best they can to ensure that they're going to be the victorious team after 70 minutes, where it pays to foul now, and we want to move away from that. We're going to look at some incidences of rule violating conduct or categorization. I'll explain both to you.
McGrath's kick out, absolutely perfect. Paddy challenge and Paddy McGrath. Trouble. And straight away. Well.
Okay, that one was what we would call a high tackle. And at the moment, it's just rough play. But we're looking at it and we're saying, how bad is that tackle and how dangerous is it to the player concerned?
Lee Keegan looking for Andy Moore, but he's left the pass short again. Played away by the defender, and in any event, the Roscommon man fouled, and yet another Mayo attack comes to nothing.
Well, the first thing, Mayo took the free from about 10 metres away from where the free was given.
Okay, in that incident, the player is removed from the field of play for a deliberate trip. So are our fouling and our categorisation of fouls proportionate? The deliberate trip caused very little harm to the player concerned or the opponent concerned, and yet the player who committed the foul had to leave the field in that game for the rest of the game because it was last season. But yet the player who made the very dangerous high tackle only received a yellow card. Do we understand where we're looking at foul play? They're not proportionate. That may be cynical, but the rule says to deliberately trip an opponent, he must get a black card. And in that match, I had no choice but to issue the black card. But you look at the other one and you say, well, surely the opponent was in more in danger of injuring himself or being injured recklessly because of the high tackle. And they say there's no cynical fouling in hurling.
Torring Mannion floats that up in the air. Johnny Glynn is under it. Big collisions, big hits there. Here's Jason Flynn. Flynn has been fouled. Flynn dragged down. The referee will want a word with the Kilkenny man who pulled him to the ground.
So to pull an opponent to the ground, to pull an opponent down in hurling is just a yellow card infraction. In football, it's seen as cynical and it's a black card. So we also have an inconsistency in the playing rules. Even they are two different sports, but we have dual referees now who are expected to be experts in both codes. And because of the difference in the language of the rules and the outcomes, that causes inconsistencies as well.
Perhaps to a previous clash, let's just watch it here. Richie Hogan just a little bit high on Cathal Barrett.
Yeah, he came in to hit him a shoulder, and Barrett, if you just watch Cathal Barrett, he ducks out and tackle. That's an elbow straight to the head.
So that's a quite high-profile one from this year's All-Ireland hurling final, where contact was made with the player's head. The correct decision was arrived at on the day, which was a red card. Why is it up there? Because we need to be very careful about how we report that in our match report. Because if we cited that player for striking with the elbow and the player proved it was striking with the shoulder, I think it's changed now, David, isn't it? You can't overturn it if it's a similar decision. But we need to be very careful. That could have been covered by behaving in a manner dangerous to an opponent. The right decision was made on the day, only because James learned from his previous match. Same referee, match previous.
He did, and he got up very fast as well, in fairness to Richie. Credit to him, because he could have laid down there, and I think it's the Cooper's holding his side. That's because Richie Temple, I'd say, hit off him as he came in to tackle him.
Okay, so you can see how dangerous those tackles are becoming, and they're becoming more prevalent in both football and hurling. And the buzzword that's going around the field sports at the moment is concussion. And referees are very fearful in relation to head injuries. And what we're saying now is head is red. Anything to the head is a red card. But both those players were removed from the field of play for seriously dangerous tackles. Now look at the All-Ireland football final. And we're going to look at 3 incidents of holding. First hold by the player in blue, free and a note. The player got a tick in the book, there was no yellow card given. Second foul. So we have the same player in blue holding the arm of the player in the green. Holding, yellow card, 2 fouls, 2 noting infractions. And there we have the hold. Third foul. Hopefully to play. Holding again. With 3 holding infractions. So we have 3 noting infractions in that game. A note and a note equals a yellow, plus a further note is a second yellow equals a red. How many people here would agree that what the player in blue did on the day meant that he needed to leave the field of play for the rest of the game compared to what the Kilkenny player did in the hurling final? Do we see the proportionality of the fouls? According to the rules, he had to go. But we're ending a player's game for 3 noting infractions or persistent fouling, in this case, compared to ending a player's game for a very dangerous head-high tackle. So our rules are not proportionate. And the noting system, the carding system, doesn't result in the proportionate, layout of infractions. And what David and his group are trying to do is to make the rules easier to read for referees, easier to understand, easier to implement. That the fouls are dealt with proportionately, foul play is not rewarded, and as David said, that the fouls are dealt with contemporaneously, so that they're dealt with on the day.
David,
yes.
Sorry, I think I've asked you this question before, but for the benefit of people, you have indicated to the player in blue that that's 2.
Yeah.
Are you obliged to do that?
No. No, I'm not obliged to do that. But I think just out of good game management and respect for the players, you let them know what they are being carded for, the reason why, and particularly in relation to the noting ones, because they need to know their next noting infraction and they're gone. But that is the structure of the rules at the moment. So we need this change, because at the end of the All-Ireland final, I'm standing at 78 minutes, which is actually 80 minutes in total. We played 2 minutes injury time in the first half, having run close to 11 kilometres in the match, which was more than any player. And my heartbeat was going somewhere between 150 and 200 beats per minute throughout the whole match. It reached 202 beats per minute. And I'm jaded, I'm wreck-tired at the very end of the match, and Tommy Walsh turns to me and he says, "David, if I lift him, are you going to blow it?" And my answer is, I don't know. Because I now have to think through 36 different technical fouls before I can give him a response to a scenario I've never been faced with before, knowing that the potential outcome of me deciding to blow a foul or not is going to decide an All-Ireland final and either hinder a team from winning 5 in a row or allowing a team to win 5 in a row. And I asked Conor Lane on the sideline, and Conor says, "I don't know." And the third time David asked me, I had gone through all the rules in my head. And the only rule that there is in the rule book is for a player to interfere with the goalposts for the purpose of gaining an advantage or for distracting his opponent. So once the players didn't interfere with the goalposts, the lift, according to the rules, was totally legal. And I said to David, or to Tommy, I'm not going to blow it. Luckily, it didn't happen because I wouldn't have been able to leave the pitch safely if it did. But that's how complex the rules are. And that was the pressure I was under in the last minute of the most important game that's happened inside in the stadium in 30 years. And that's how complex the rules are. And I'm not sure, and we've discussed this, how many other inter-county referees would have been able to go through all 36 with certainty and say, you can go ahead and do that. And if the GAA bring in a rule against doing it, well, it's a technical foul because it's not on the ball, it's a foul on the man. Any technical foul inside the small rectangle is a penalty. So there would have been all-out mayhem or potential for it, because adding in a new rule again causes greater complexity for referees. So you can see the really difficult job we have when we're out there in the matches. And that's why I'm so happy that David and the group, and I'm a big believer in slimming down the rules, making them easier for us to read, to understand, and to implement.